The air was thick with an almost suffocating silence that Sunday morning. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, makes your ears ring, and leaves a bitter taste in your mouth, because you know something is terribly, irreversibly wrong. At the Brentwood estate, the kind of home that most people only see in magazines, with sprawling gardens, security cameras in every corner, and the quiet hum of wealth that usually promises safety, tragedy had struck. 2 lives cut short. 2 bodies discovered in what should have been the sanctuary of family. And in the midst of that horror, one figure would allegedly step forward, or rather, into a moment that no one could have predicted, attempting to alter the scene of a crime that had already frozen in time. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. What would drive someone to do that? To enter a house already claimed by the authorities, a house that had been locked down, photographed, cataloged, and treated as sacred evidence? And who would be reckless, brazen, or desperate enough to risk it all? Those are the questions that hang over this story, questions that Jake and Romy Reiner have now answered in a way that the world cannot ignore. It's over for Tracy Reiner. The statement is simple, short, brutal, but the implications are anything but. According to sources, what Jake and Romy revealed is not a matter of speculation. Allegedly, security logs, timestamps, and eyewitness accounts back up their claim. Allegedly, Tracy Reiner, in the wake of one of the most shocking murders in recent Los Angeles history, attempted to remove or destroy items from the very estate where her father, Rob Reiner, and stepmother, Michelle, had been brutally killed. It is a claim that, if proven, changes everything we think we know about the night, the family, and the web of betrayal and suspicion that has now enveloped them. To understand the gravity of what allegedly happened, you need to first step inside the timeline of that day. December 14th, the day that began like any other Sunday in Brentwood. Sunshine spilled across manicured lawns. A faint breeze rustled the leaves of the grand oak trees lining the driveway, and inside, the Reiner family moved through their home, unaware that by nightfall, everything would be unrecognizable. Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found with multiple sharp force injuries, officially ruled homicides. Their son, Nick, 32, was arrested that very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But the story does not begin and does not end with Nick. For months, the focus was on the shocking crime itself. But as the investigation continued, attention slowly shifted to what happened after the bodies were discovered, and that is where Tracy Reiner allegedly enters the narrative in a way no one could have predicted. Romy, 27, the daughter of Rob and Michelle, is reported to have discovered the bodies. The horror of the moment is hard to overstate. Finding your parents in such a violent state, the quiet punctuated by the horrifying realization that life as you knew it had ended. And yet, even in that instant, she reportedly noticed something else, something that would later color every decision, every suspicion, and every family argument that followed. She spoke to authorities about a family member she described as dangerous, a warning that would later gain weight as additional evidence and timelines were reconstructed. It is here that Jake and Romy's statement gains its power. Allegedly, Tracy, in the days following the discovery of her father and stepmother's bodies, attempted to tamper with items that law enforcement had already secured. According to reports, the attempt was not subtle. Security logs captured movement that should not have occurred. Timestamps recorded activity at odd hours, and eyewitness accounts suggest that items were touched, moved, or removed. Why would someone risk being caught in such circumstances? What could be more important than the weight of murder investigation procedures, the eyes of law enforcement, and the permanence of what had already occurred? Some of the details remain unclear. Sources differ, witnesses contradict each other, and timelines are still being meticulously reconstructed by investigators. But one thing is undeniable. The alleged actions attributed to Tracy Reiner added an entirely new layer of complexity to an already devastating case. It shifted the lens from not just who committed the murders, but to who could be trusted, who could act under pressure, and who might have been trying to rewrite events in real time. Imagine, for a moment, the house itself. The Brentwood estate is a fortress of wealth and security, a place where every hallway is lined with cameras, every entrance monitored, every exit documented. To enter after a crime scene has been locked, to move through it undetected or unnoticed, to touch objects that now serve as evidence. It is almost cinematic in its audacity. And yet, according to Jake and Romy, that is precisely what happened. Allegedly. The Reiner family, like many, was no stranger to wealth, influence, or public attention. But the events of that Sunday stripped away the veneer of safety and privilege, revealing raw human emotion, the fractures of family loyalty, and the dark possibility that desperation can lead someone to act against those they claim to love. And in the aftermath, as police and investigators pieced together what happened, the focus shifted. Not just to Nick, not just to the murders themselves, but to the alleged post-crime actions of Tracy, a shift that has rocked the family, and one that the public is only now learning about in full. Jake and Romy have taken a step that is as dramatic as it is rare. They have spoken openly, publicly, and without apparent hesitation. Their words, "It's over for Tracy Reiner," carry the weight of accusation, heartbreak, and the finality of family judgment. The question on everyone's mind is simple yet devastating. If what they say is true, how much did Tracy allegedly manipulate or attempt to manipulate? And how will this affect the course of justice, the perception of the Reiner family, and the wider narrative that has captivated so many? The introduction of alleged evidence tampering changes the story from a tragic murder case to something more intricate, more unsettling. It transforms the narrative into a psychological puzzle where loyalty, fear, grief, and survival instincts collide. What do we know for certain? Security logs exist. Witness statements exist. Actions allegedly occurred that could alter the understanding of the night's events. What do we not know? The exact motives, the full scope of what may have been moved or destroyed, and the ultimate consequences remain to be revealed. And yet, the allure, the tension, and the drama lie precisely in that unknown. For every clue teased, every timestamp noted, every witness recollection given, there is another layer waiting to surface. Questions multiply. Did Tracy act alone, or were others involved? Was this an impulsive act of panic, or a calculated attempt to cover up evidence? How do you reconcile grief and suspicion within a family already reeling from unimaginable loss? And most importantly, what does it mean for the people left behind? Jake, Romy, and the others trying to navigate a nightmare that no one could have prepared for? Even now, weeks after the murders, the questions continue to hang like a shadow over the estate. Security footage, photographs, logs, and statements are being meticulously analyzed, each detail examined for discrepancies, patterns, or hidden truths. Jake and Romy's decision to go public adds another layer of scrutiny, and with it, an unspoken warning that nothing, not even family, can be assumed innocent when the stakes are this high. This story is far from over. The first shock was the murders themselves. The second shock, allegedly, is the attempt to manipulate what remained after. And the third, perhaps, is the unraveling of trust, the exposure of vulnerability, and the revelation that even those closest to us can act in ways we never imagined. As we begin this journey, keep a question in mind. If you were standing in that house, with the weight of death, grief, and suspicion pressing down on you, what would you do? Would you freeze? Would you run? Or would you, like Tracy allegedly did, try to erase traces of a past you no longer control? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The morning of December 14th dawned like any other in Brentwood, with the faint hum of city life barely audible behind the hedges and high walls that protected the Reiner estate. Sunshine spilled across the perfectly trimmed lawns, birds chirped lazily in the crisp winter air, and inside the house, there was an ordinary calm, ordinary until it wasn't. For Rob Reiner and Michelle, the day was meant to be quiet, a Sunday spent with family, perhaps in the kitchen with coffee, the smell of toast filling the room, or sitting together watching the late morning news. But by mid-afternoon, that ordinary calm would shatter forever. When Romy Reiner, 27, reportedly entered the estate that afternoon, she encountered a scene no one should ever face. The details are grim, heart-wrenching, and difficult to recount. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were discovered with multiple sharp force injuries. Law enforcement would later describe the manner of death simply as homicide. But for those who found them, that word is clinical, a poor reflection of the chaos, grief, and horror the human mind experiences in the moment of discovery. It was Romy who called authorities. Allegedly, she did so with trembling hands, speaking rapidly, her voice cracking as she conveyed both the shock of finding her parents and the fear she felt regarding a family member she deemed dangerous. That warning would later become a central point in the investigation. It was not merely a passing observation. It was a caution, a premonition, a red flag that investigators could not ignore. Police responded quickly, arriving at the estate and securing the scene. Officers moved through the house with methodical precision, taking photographs, collecting evidence, and documenting every detail. Crime scene tape cordoned off areas, and the home, once a place of warmth and familiarity, became a carefully controlled environment, frozen in time, where each object, each footprint, each fingerprint could hold the key to solving a devastating puzzle. But even as the initial investigation progressed, cracks began to appear in the narrative. Investigators would later report that certain entries in the estate's security logs appeared anomalous. Timestamps indicated movement after the crime scene had been secured, a movement that, according to reports, should not have been possible. At first, these anomalies were small, easy to dismiss. A door opening, a camera motion sensor triggered, a motion detected in a hallway. But as the investigation dug deeper, it became clear that these small anomalies could not be explained away by coincidence or error. Jake and Romy Reiner would later allege that Tracy Reiner, a family member, was responsible for this unusual activity. According to their claims, Tracy had allegedly attempted to remove or disturb items from the estate after the scene had already been secured by law enforcement. Security footage, witness statements, and digital logs reportedly corroborate this. If true, this was no ordinary interference. This was deliberate, risky, and calculated behavior, an action that escalated an already tragic situation into something far more complex. Consider the estate itself. A $13.5 million property, sprawling and sophisticated, with security cameras covering every entrance and exit, smart locks, and 24-hour surveillance. Each hallway, staircase, and room was under constant observation. To enter after the crime scene had been sealed and move about without detection would require both daring and precision. Allegedly, the movement captured on security logs corresponds with times when law enforcement had concluded its initial examination, meaning someone was attempting to act in the shadow of authority. The emotional weight of this is staggering. For Romy and Jake, the pain of losing their parents was compounded by the suspicion and fear that another family member, someone they had grown up with, someone they trusted, might have been involved in actions that could compromise justice. That fear, that sense of betrayal, is palpable when they speak publicly about the events. And according to their statements, it is precisely why they came forward, to prevent further interference, to ensure that the truth, no matter how painful, would not be hidden. Investigators, meanwhile, had to balance sensitivity with scrutiny. They were not only examining the scene of a brutal double homicide, but also analyzing potential post-crime tampering. Each log entry, each motion detection, each timestamp became a critical piece of the puzzle. And when eyewitness statements were added to the mix, neighbors reporting lights turning on at odd hours, security staff noting unexpected movements, the investigation's scope widened, encompassing both the initial murders and the alleged attempts to alter the scene afterward. What complicates the narrative even further is the timing of events. December 14th is marked as the date of death for Rob and Michelle, yet there was uncertainty in the hours immediately preceding the discovery. Investigators had to reconcile discrepancies in security footage, witness recollections, and statements from family members. Romy's warning to police about a dangerous family member became increasingly significant as analysts worked to construct an accurate timeline. At the center of this unfolding drama is the question of motive. Why would anyone, especially a family member, risk tampering with evidence in such a high-profile case? Jake and Romy assert that Tracy's actions were deliberate, potentially driven by a desire to protect herself, hide complicity, or control what information became available to authorities. Psychological analysis of such behavior points to panic, fear, and perhaps desperation, but also to calculated risk-taking. An understanding of what could and could not be observed, a sense of timing, and an awareness of the surveillance environment. For the audience, it is impossible not to be drawn into the tension of these moments. Imagine walking through your childhood home, now a crime scene, knowing that someone you once trusted may be attempting to manipulate or destroy what is left behind. The mix of grief, fear, and disbelief is suffocating. And yet, according to Jake and Romy, it is precisely this emotional complexity that led them to act, to document, and to speak out. The events of that day also cast a long shadow over Nick Reiner's arrest. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Nick became the focal point of media attention, public speculation, and family scrutiny. But as investigators re-examined security logs and statements, attention shifted in part toward the alleged post-crime actions of Tracy. Jake and Romy's claims suggested that even after Nick was taken into custody, the estate was not entirely secure from interference. This added an additional layer of urgency, forcing authorities to consider not just the crime itself, but the subsequent actions of those connected to the family. By the end of the day, the Reiner estate had transformed from a private sanctuary into the epicenter of a story that combined murder, suspicion, and alleged tampering with evidence. Every object within the home, photos, personal belongings, security equipment, became a potential clue. Every action, no matter how minor, was scrutinized. The lines between grief, anger, and fear blurred as family members, investigators, and security personnel tried to understand not only what had happened but why. And then there was the question of timing. Security logs, eyewitness accounts, and physical evidence pointed to activity that occurred after the scene was secured. For investigators, this raised critical questions. How did the alleged actions occur? Were they impulsive or premeditated? And most importantly, what impact would they have on the ongoing investigation into the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner? For Jake and Romy, the answers were deeply personal. Allegedly witnessing or discovering these actions, they faced a decision: stay silent or come forward. The choice to speak out, to publicly accuse Tracy of alleged interference, was not made lightly. It reflected a desire to protect the integrity of the investigation, honor the memory of their parents, and confront what they perceived as betrayal within the family. The first day of this nightmare was over, but the story was only beginning. The discovery of the bodies marked a tragic climax, but the alleged post-crime actions introduced a new element: the realization that even in death, the events surrounding the Reiner family could not remain contained. And for the audience watching this story unfold, the tension is palpable. The question is no longer simply who committed the murders. It is who can be trusted, whose actions can be explained, and whose motives remain hidden in the shadows. As night fell over the estate, investigators continued to piece together the timeline, attempting to separate fact from allegation, reality from rumor, and truth from fear. Every log, every witness statement, every camera feed became a thread in a complex tapestry of grief, suspicion, and alleged deceit. And at the center of it all was a simple, chilling realization: the crime scene was no longer frozen in time. Someone, allegedly Tracy Reiner, had entered it, potentially altering evidence, and forcing both investigators and family members to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, loyalty, and the lengths to which someone might go to protect themselves. Or to hide the truth. By the end of that first day, one thing was clear: the Reiner family would never be the same. The events of December 14th had frozen time in one sense, but in another, they had set off a chain reaction that would unravel relationships, challenge loyalties, and reveal layers of complexity no one could have anticipated. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The Brentwood estate was more than just a home. To the untrained eye, it was a sprawling mansion, an emblem of wealth, prestige, and quiet luxury. But to investigators and, as it would later turn out, to the Reiner family themselves, it was a labyrinth of secrets, digital footprints, and structural intricacies that could either reveal the truth or obscure it. Every room, hallway, and hidden corner told a story, not just of who lived there, but of the events that had unfolded within its walls on that fateful day. The first striking feature of the estate was its layout. It was a house designed to balance openness and privacy, luxury and security. Wide corridors led to sunlit rooms, each equipped with smart home technology seamlessly integrated into the design. Cameras were discreetly installed in strategic positions: hallways, entryways, common areas. Motion sensors lined the ceilings, recording movement with a precision that few outsiders could imagine. Every entrance had a security panel, and every exit was monitored with a combination of alarms, access logs, and digital records. To outsiders, it might have seemed like overkill, but for a family of this stature, it was standard protocol. Security footage played a crucial role in the unfolding story. Every second was recorded, stored, and backed up. Analysts would later pore over hours of video, looking for anomalies: a shadow moving slightly off schedule, a door opening at an odd hour, a figure passing through a hallway where no one should have been. It was in these subtle irregularities that the investigators began to notice something troubling: timestamps that indicated movement after the crime scene had been secured. Anomalies that raised questions about who had entered the home and why. The estate was also home to countless personal artifacts: photographs, heirlooms, jewelry, documents, items that had both sentimental and potential evidentiary value. Each item's placement mattered. A misplaced photograph, a drawer left open, a note missing from a desk, all could tell a story. Investigators were aware that even minor disturbances could significantly alter the interpretation of the scene. And according to Jake and Romy Reiner, it was precisely these kinds of disturbances that allegedly occurred after Tracy Reiner entered the estate following the murders. Imagine walking through a home like this in the aftermath of tragedy. The air is heavy with grief, the silence punctuated by the low murmur of law enforcement personnel discussing evidence, and every footstep echoes like a warning. For Romy and Jake, witnessing the meticulous recording of every detail must have been surreal, a stark reminder of how fragile life and evidence can be. But when they allegedly observed or discovered actions that interfered with this delicate process, the sense of urgency became overwhelming. The design of the estate itself created both opportunity and challenge. While the cameras and sensors covered most areas, there were blind spots, nooks, and passages that a knowledgeable person could exploit. Accessing certain rooms required knowledge of the layout, the location of sensors, and the timing of patrols. This complexity is critical to understanding why investigators took the alleged post-crime activity so seriously. To allegedly navigate these spaces undetected, someone would need both courage and familiarity. A combination that pointed directly, according to Jake and Romy, to Tracy Reiner. Another layer of complication came from the digital systems integrated throughout the house. Smart locks, alarm panels, and interconnected security devices all maintained a digital record of every interaction. Each swipe of a keycard, each code entered, each motion detected was stored with a timestamp, creating an unbroken chain of potential evidence. For investigators, this was both a blessing and a challenge. The digital trail could confirm or contradict witness statements, but it also required careful analysis to avoid misinterpretation. And yet, when the logs revealed movement that coincided with alleged interference by Tracy, the alarm bells were immediate. Beyond technology, the estate's physical geography played a role in shaping the narrative. The property's size and layout meant that anyone attempting to remove or disturb items would need to move quickly and quietly, avoiding cameras and security staff. Even brief movements in certain corridors could trigger sensors or be captured on footage. The precision required for such actions underscores the gravity of the alleged interference and explains why Jake and Romy were so vocal in their condemnation. For those outside the Reiner family, it might be difficult to grasp the psychological impact of this environment. Walking through a house that was simultaneously a sanctuary and a crime scene, knowing that one's parents had been violently killed, and then allegedly witnessing a family member attempting to manipulate evidence, it is a scenario few could endure without intense emotional strain. Jake and Romy's decision to speak out publicly was not just about justice. It was about asserting control in a situation that had spiraled into chaos. Investigators, meanwhile, had to reconstruct the timeline with precision. Security footage was cross-referenced with timestamps from smart locks, motion sensors, and entry logs. Every discrepancy was scrutinized. Forensic teams examined the placement of objects, the presence of fingerprints, and the sequence of movements. When anomalous activity was discovered after the crime scene had been secured, it was treated not as a minor oversight, but as a potential disruption that could compromise the integrity of the investigation. The alleged tampering by Tracy Reiner added a layer of urgency and complexity. According to Jake and Romy, the interference was not limited to one area of the estate. Reports suggest that multiple locations were affected. Rooms where documents were kept, areas containing personal effects, and even spaces that might hold digital devices or storage media. Each of these locations carried the potential to yield critical evidence, and any disturbance could have significant implications for the case. The estate itself, in this context, became more than just a backdrop. It became a character in the unfolding drama. Its architecture, security systems, and hidden corridors were all integral to understanding how events could have transpired. The interaction between the physical space and the alleged actions of family members created a dynamic narrative, one in which the home both revealed and concealed truths. Jake and Romy's insistence that Tracy's alleged actions were deliberate underscores the high stakes involved. In a house designed to record and monitor everything, any attempt to interfere with evidence is inherently risky. The Reiners' wealth, influence, and technological sophistication did not provide immunity. If anything, it heightened the potential consequences of interference. Every camera, sensor, and digital log worked against anyone attempting to manipulate the scene. Yet, according to allegations, these constraints were deliberately navigated, creating a scenario that investigators could not ignore. Even as the investigation unfolded, the psychological impact on the family cannot be overstated. The estate, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a site of fear, suspicion, and grief. The alleged interference by Tracy Reiner intensified these emotions, introducing doubt and mistrust into relationships that had already been strained by tragedy. The Reiners were forced to confront not only the death of loved ones, but also the possibility of deliberate betrayal within their ranks. For the audience following this story, the estate offers a compelling lens through which to understand the events. It is not simply a backdrop for tragedy. It is a complex environment where technology, architecture, and human behavior intersect in ways that illuminate the motivations, opportunities, and risks faced by those involved. Every security log, motion sensor, and camera feed becomes a piece of the puzzle, and each alleged disturbance adds tension, drama, and suspense to an already gripping narrative. As night fell over the Brentwood estate, the home that had once symbolized safety and luxury now stood as a silent witness to events that would ripple far beyond its walls. The discovery of the murders marked only the beginning. The alleged post-crime interference transformed the estate into a puzzle, a labyrinth of clues and contradictions that would challenge investigators, family members, and the public alike. And just when it seemed that the physical and digital complexity of the estate had been fully mapped, an anomaly in the logs surfaced, an entry that should not have existed. A movement at a time when the house was supposed to be completely secured, a timestamp that contradicted previous assumptions. It was here that the story shifted from tragedy to mystery, from loss to suspicion, and from grief to a tense, unrelenting drama that would pull everyone deeper into the Reiner family's darkest hours. But what came next would deepen the puzzle even further, and no one anticipated the revelations that would follow. Every investigation has its turning point. For the Reiner case, the turning point came not from eyewitness testimony, not from the initial shock of the murders, and not from the obvious tragedy of the loss of Rob and Michelle. It came from a name, a single name etched into a security log, a name that, when discovered, immediately raised more questions than answers, more suspicion than comfort. And for Jake and Romy Reiner, that name became the undeniable signal that their worst fears were beginning to materialize. It started as an ordinary review of the estate's digital records. After the bodies were discovered and the scene secured, investigators meticulously analyzed every camera feed, every motion sensor, and every smart lock entry. Every device in the house had logged activity, creating a digital paper trail that could, in theory, tell the story of the day's events down to the second. but as they dug deeper, anomalies emerged. Certain logs suggested movement in the estate after law enforcement had completed their initial sweep. Doors opened that should have remained closed. Motion sensors triggered in corridors where no authorized personnel were expected. Then, amid this sea of data, one entry stood out. A name, a timestamp, and a location. According to Jake and Romy, it was Tracy Reiner. The timestamp indicated movement within the estate hours after the scene was officially secured. The location corresponded to a hallway leading to multiple rooms containing items of personal and evidentiary importance. For investigators, this was more than a coincidence. In a house monitored with the precision of a bank vault, such an entry could not be ignored. The implications were immediate and profound. If the log was accurate, it meant that Tracy had allegedly entered the estate at a time when she should not have. It meant that objects in certain areas could have been touched, moved, or removed. It meant that the integrity of the crime scene, meticulously maintained by law enforcement, had been potentially compromised. And for the family, it introduced an unimaginable element of betrayal. Someone they trusted, someone within their own circle, might have acted in a way that threatened both justice and their own grief process. The security log, however, was only part of the story. Investigators cross-referenced the timestamp with footage from nearby cameras, which revealed brief, subtle movement in the hallways. Motion sensors corroborated the digital entry, recording a presence that matched the timing of the log entry. Witness statements added another layer. Staff and neighbors reported seeing lights in rooms that should have been dark, doors opening unexpectedly, and shadows passing through areas that had been declared off-limits. For Jake and Romy, the discovery of the name in the log was devastating. The trauma of losing their parents had already left them reeling. Now, the added weight of alleged interference by Tracy Reiner amplified the sense of betrayal and fear. Every step she allegedly took within the estate raised questions about what she might have been attempting to remove or obscure. Was it a document? A personal item? Something digital? The uncertainty created a tension that no one could ignore. Psychologists and behavioral experts later analyzed this alleged activity, pointing out that entering a secured crime scene is rarely impulsive. It requires planning, awareness, and a degree of audacity. The very act of navigating monitored spaces undetected suggests knowledge of the environment and its surveillance systems. This analysis only reinforced Jake and Romy's assertion that the actions were deliberate. According to their public statements, the log entry confirmed what they had long suspected. Someone had interfered with the scene in a way that could not be explained by accident. But the log alone did not tell the full story. Investigators had to consider alternative explanations. Could the entry have been a glitch? Could someone else have had access under Tracy's credentials? Was there a technical error in the system? Each of these possibilities had to be explored to ensure the integrity of the investigation. And yet, when combined with corroborating footage, motion detection, and witness statements, the theory of interference gained strength. The psychological impact on the family was equally significant. Imagine witnessing a digital record that seems to contradict the reality you know. Imagine seeing a name associated with movement at a time when grief and shock should have been the only presence in the house. For Jake and Romy, the log was more than data. It was confirmation of a fear they had long felt but could not yet articulate publicly. It was proof that the estate, even after law enforcement had sealed it, had been violated. For the investigators, the log entry prompted a deeper analysis of the estate's security network. Every camera angle was reviewed, every hallway sensor recalibrated, every access code scrutinized. They mapped out a detailed timeline of movements, comparing each entry with eyewitness accounts, staff schedules, and digital backups. The anomalous entry, Tracy's name, was examined from every angle. It was not merely a note in a database. It became a key piece of evidence that could link alleged actions to a motive, method, and potential outcome. Jake and Romy reportedly felt both vindicated and horrified. Vindicated, because the log entry seemed to confirm suspicions of interference. Horrified, because it suggested intentionality, risk, and perhaps even an attempt to manipulate or control the narrative surrounding their parents' deaths. According to their statements, this digital footprint was the moment they realized that the tragedy of the murders was compounded by actions that were, at least allegedly, deliberate and deceitful. The name in the log also played a critical role in the public narrative. When Jake and Romy went on record stating, "It's over for Tracy Reiner," they were, in essence, pointing to this digital evidence. It was not a mere accusation. It was a claim grounded in timestamps, sensor activity, and corroborated observations. For the audience, the revelation of a single name, embedded in digital records, corroborated by motion detection, and tied to sensitive areas of the estate, served as a powerful turning point, illustrating that the story was far more complex than a simple crime scene. Yet, even with this apparent confirmation, questions remained. How long had the alleged interference lasted? What objects or information were potentially impacted? Were there other entries, perhaps overlooked, that could reveal additional actions? Each unanswered question created suspense, tension, and anticipation, driving the narrative forward and keeping both investigators and the public engaged. The name in the log was more than a piece of data. It was a narrative anchor. It provided a reference point around which the story of alleged interference could be constructed. It offered a tangible, traceable element in an otherwise chaotic and emotional scenario. For the family, it transformed suspicion into actionable concern. For investigators, it transformed ambiguity into a focused line of inquiry. And yet, as significant as the log entry was, it was only the beginning. Other evidence, corroborating statements, and subsequent revelations would continue to unfold, each adding depth and complexity to the narrative. For Jake and Romy, the log served as the first undeniable signal that their worst fears were not imagined. For investigators, it was the thread that could potentially unravel or confirm the series of alleged actions that had taken place after the initial tragedy. The digital footprint left by the name in the log carried consequences far beyond its mere presence. It framed the story of alleged interference, influenced the direction of the investigation, and heightened the stakes for every individual involved. It transformed the estate from a static crime scene into a dynamic environment of suspicion, surveillance, and strategy. But as the investigators dug deeper, cross-referencing logs, camera angles, and motion sensors, they would discover something even more unexpected, something that would call into question assumptions, challenge narratives, and push the family further into a web of fear and uncertainty. What came next would force Jake, Romy, and everyone watching this story to confront the reality that no one, not even family, could be fully trusted when tragedy, suspicion, and alleged interference collided. Sometimes the most compelling testimony comes not from those who intended to see a crime, but from those who stumbled upon it inadvertently, their observations unplanned, unfiltered, and yet profoundly revealing. In the case of the Reiner estate, witnesses played an unexpectedly crucial role. Their accounts, when combined with security logs, timestamps, and digital evidence, created a mosaic of insight that illuminated actions that might otherwise have remained hidden. The day the bodies were discovered, neighbors reported unusual activity, though many initially dismissed it as the normal ebb and flow of a wealthy, busy household. Lights flicked on in rooms that were typically unoccupied in the middle of the afternoon. Vehicles arrived and departed outside expected schedules. Shadows passed behind drawn curtains at odd times. None of these anomalies seemed particularly significant in isolation, but when investigators began cross-referencing these observations with security data, the picture began to change. One neighbor, for instance, reportedly noticed a figure moving in the estate's hallway from a vantage point obscured by trees. They didn't know it at the time, but this figure corresponded with a motion sensor triggered after law enforcement had supposedly secured the scene. At the time, the observer thought it was simply a staff member or a family member checking on something routine. In retrospect, however, the movement aligned precisely with the alleged post-crime entry linked to Tracy Reiner. Another witness, a delivery driver who arrived shortly after the initial police response, reported seeing a vehicle leaving the estate at a time that did not match any scheduled departures. The driver could not see the driver's face, and at the moment, it seemed inconsequential, a simple delivery vehicle pulling away. But investigators later learned that the vehicle's departure coincided with security logs capturing an entry that should not have existed, suggesting activity in areas of the estate that were meant to remain untouched. Staff members, too, unintentionally became witnesses. Housekeepers, maintenance personnel, and security staff provided statements that, when pieced together, highlighted anomalies. One security guard noted that an alarm panel had been accessed at an unusual hour, even though no authorized personnel were logged in at the time. Another staff member recalled hearing noises in a hallway where no one should have been moving. These observations, initially considered minor, suddenly gained significance when examined in conjunction with digital logs and timestamps. The psychological impact of these inadvertent observations cannot be overstated. Witnesses often struggle to reconcile what they saw with their expectations of normalcy. In this case, neighbors and staff were confronted with details that, while seemingly trivial in isolation, collectively painted a disturbing picture. For Jake and Romy, these witness accounts were both validating and alarming. They confirmed suspicions of interference while simultaneously highlighting the audacity and potential premeditation of the actions allegedly taken by Tracy Reiner. Investigators treat such observations carefully, knowing that memory is fallible, especially in high-stress situations. Yet the convergence of independent accounts with objective digital evidence is what gives the testimony weight. Each witness became a piece of a larger puzzle, their recollections aligning with the security footage, motion sensor data, and entry logs to form a coherent narrative of alleged post-crime activity. One particularly telling account came from a neighbor who, in passing, noticed a light switch toggled in a room that had been dark since the morning. They didn't think much of it at the time, assuming someone had entered the room to retrieve an item or adjust something trivial. However, when investigators later checked security footage and motion sensor data, they found that the room had been accessed without any authorized personnel scheduled to be present. The alignment of this accidental observation with objective data lended extraordinary significance. Witnesses also provided insight into behavior that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. Several reported seeing a family member moving quickly, appearing anxious or hurried. One described the figure carrying small objects in a way that suggested deliberate concealment. The subtle details of body language, timing, and movement, though easily overlooked, became critical in reconstructing the sequence of events. The confluence of digital evidence and human observation created a dynamic investigative landscape. Investigators had to weigh each piece of testimony against objective logs while considering human error, bias, and perception limitations. In doing so, they began to construct a timeline that not only confirmed certain movements, but also raised new questions about motive, opportunity, and intent. For Jake and Romy, these witness accounts were vital. They provided independent confirmation of anomalies they had observed or suspected. The family, already traumatized by the loss of Rob and Michelle, found in these accounts a measure of validation. That the unusual activity within the estate was not imagined, that it was noticed by others, and that it demanded further scrutiny. The presence of witnesses also complicated the narrative for Tracy Reiner. Allegedly, her actions were not entirely concealed. Even in a house equipped with sophisticated surveillance, the combination of digital and human observation created multiple layers of accountability. Each witness added another lens through which her alleged behavior could be interpreted, examined, and evaluated. But perhaps the most striking element of these observations is how unintentional they were. Witnesses didn't set out to uncover evidence. They didn't intend to intervene in the family's tragedy. And yet, their seemingly mundane observations, shadows, lights, sounds, vehicles, provided a window into actions that might otherwise have remained invisible. This reinforces the idea that in complex investigations, even the smallest details can have disproportionate significance. The narrative arc created by these witnesses is both dramatic and chilling. On one level, it underscores the sheer audacity of allegedly entering a secured crime scene. On another, it highlights the vulnerability of even the most controlled environments. No matter how sophisticated the estate's security systems, or how carefully the crime scene was maintained, unplanned human observation provided critical insight. For the audience, this raises compelling questions. What other anomalies might have been observed but unreported? Could additional witnesses exist who have yet to come forward? How much of the alleged interference remains undocumented, existing only in fleeting moments? caught by human perception rather than a camera lens. The weight of these observations culminated in a sense of inevitability for Jake and Romy. They were not merely grieving children. They were witnesses in their own right, corroborated by the accidental testimonies of others. Together, these pieces formed a mosaic of alleged interference that could not be easily dismissed. And yet, as compelling as the witnesses' accounts were, the investigators knew that the digital trail, the logs, timestamps, and surveillance footage would ultimately carry the most weight in determining the veracity of the allegations. But without the context provided by these inadvertent witnesses, even the most precise logs might have been interpreted ambiguously. In the end, the witnesses who didn't know they were witnesses became essential narrators of a story that was as much about human perception as it was about objective fact. Their observations bridged the gap between digital evidence and lived experience, revealing layers of behavior, timing, and intent that might otherwise have remained hidden. But even as the investigators compiled these statements and aligned them with digital records, an unsettling realization emerged. Some observations suggested a level of intentionality and planning that was deeply troubling. If the alleged interference was deliberate, it meant that someone within the family had acted with knowledge of both the environment and the potential consequences, a revelation that would push Jake and Romy closer to the conclusion they would eventually voice publicly. What came next would not only confirm suspicions hinted at by these witnesses, but would also uncover details that no one, not even the most observant neighbor or staff member, could have predicted. In the aftermath of tragedy, silence is often the default. Grief, shock, and fear can freeze even the most vocal among us. But when Jake Reiner chose to speak publicly about the alleged post-crime actions of Tracy Reiner, that silence shattered. His words, deliberate and unwavering, carried not only the weight of personal loss, but also the force of accusation. "It's over for Tracy Reiner," he declared. A statement that would reverberate across the investigation, the media, and the Reiner family itself. The decision to speak was not instantaneous. For weeks, Jake grappled with a mix of sorrow and suspicion. The murders of Rob and Michelle had already left him in emotional turmoil. But the alleged interference with the estate's crime scene introduced an additional layer of stress, one that combined grief with outrage, fear with disbelief. Every log entry, motion sensor trigger, and witness account pointing toward Tracy Reiner amplified his internal struggle. Was it truly necessary to go public? Could he trust investigators to act on the evidence without escalating the situation? Ultimately, the gravity of the alleged actions outweighed the instinct for silence. Jake realized that the integrity of the investigation, and perhaps the pursuit of justice for his parents, depended on clarity, transparency, and direct confrontation. His choice to speak was as much about accountability as it was about warning the public, warning investigators, and warning those within the family that certain behaviors could not be ignored. When Jake addressed the press, he did so with precision. His tone was calm but unflinching, each word chosen to convey both conviction and clarity. He detailed the anomalies recorded in the estate's security logs, the corroborating motion sensor activity, and the unexpected observations from neighbors and staff. He described the alleged interference not as speculation, but as a series of actions that, in his view, directly compromised the crime scene. For the audience, his statements were both shocking and illuminating. Up until that moment, the narrative largely focused on the murders themselves. The acts committed by Nick Reiner, the law enforcement response, the timeline of discovery. Jake's revelation shifted attention to a new layer of the story, what allegedly happened after the scene had been secured. The scope of suspicion expanded, and viewers were forced to consider the possibility that someone within the family might have acted with intention to manipulate evidence. Jake's approach combined emotional resonance with factual detail. He recounted the discovery of the bodies by Romy, the initial shock, and the immediate involvement of authorities. Then he introduced the anomalies, the subtle but critical details that hinted at interference. By structuring his narrative in this way, he guided the audience from grief into suspicion, from observation into accusation. Each step reinforced the plausibility of the alleged actions while maintaining the emotional gravity of the family's loss. Importantly, Jake also emphasized the corroborating role of his sister. Romy, he explained, had not only discovered the bodies but had observed behaviors that raised immediate concern. Together, they formed a narrative alliance, two siblings united in grief, observation, and the pursuit of truth. Their testimony, when combined with digital evidence, painted a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Jake's revelation also served to highlight the complexity of human behavior under duress. He did not portray Tracy Reiner simply as a villain, but as a figure whose alleged choices had profound consequences. By framing the alleged interference as a deliberate action within a high-stakes environment, he underscored the calculated nature of the behavior and the risk involved. This perspective added psychological depth to the narrative, inviting the audience to consider motive, opportunity, and emotional state. As Jake spoke, the media and investigators listened closely. His public statements added a new dimension to the case, prompting further scrutiny of the estate's security logs and motion sensor data. Allegations that had previously been speculative were now anchored in testimony that could be cross-referenced, analyzed, and, potentially, substantiated. The digital evidence alone was compelling. Jake's corroboration transformed it into a narrative that demanded attention. The timing of Jake's public statements was also strategic. By waiting until key evidence had been reviewed and corroborated, he avoided the pitfalls of premature accusation while ensuring that the information reached the appropriate channels. This careful approach reinforced the credibility of his claims and demonstrated an understanding of both public perception and investigative procedure. For viewers, Jake's declaration represented a turning point. The narrative was no longer solely about murder. It was about control, influence, and alleged manipulation in the immediate aftermath. The story became layered, suspenseful, and emotionally charged. Every timestamp, camera angle, and witness statement now had context, creating a sense of anticipation for the revelations still to come. Yet, even as Jake's words reverberated publicly, new questions arose. What exactly had been touched or removed? How much of the alleged interference could be verified independently? And most unsettling, if these actions were deliberate, what did they reveal about intentions, knowledge, and risk-taking within the family? These questions lingered, driving curiosity and deepening the narrative tension. Jake's choice to break his silence also set a precedent within the family. Romy, too, became more forthcoming, offering insights into the anomalies she had witnessed, the warning she had given authorities, and her observations of alleged behavior that seemed calculated and purposeful. Together, Jake and Romy created a unified front, framing the story not merely as a family dispute, but as an intricate web of grief, suspicion, and potential deception that demanded careful examination. In the days that followed, investigators reanalyzed the estate's security systems, cross-referencing Jake's public claims with digital logs. The alignment between testimony and technology added a sense of urgency. Each corroborated detail strengthened the narrative of alleged interference and highlighted the risks associated with tampering in a high-security environment. Jake's public statements also had a profound effect on the broader audience. They illustrated the stakes involved, humanized the family's grief, and provided a roadmap for understanding the complex sequence of events. The combination of emotional depth and factual specificity made his testimony both credible and compelling. A rare balance in cases that are as sensational as they are tragic. Yet, even with all the clarity that Jake provided, uncertainty remained. The estate was large, the security systems complex, and the alleged interference subtle. Investigators continued to parse data, review footage, and analyze every anomaly. Each revelation brought clarity but also raised new questions, creating a tension that would carry through the unfolding narrative. For Jake, speaking out was both cathartic and dangerous. It placed him in the public eye, exposed him to scrutiny, and forced him to confront painful memories. But it also allowed him to assert control over the narrative, frame the allegations clearly, and ensure that the alleged actions of Tracy Reiner could not be ignored. And yet, even as Jake's voice resonated publicly, the story was far from complete. Investigators, armed with testimony, logs, and motion data, were beginning to uncover patterns that suggested additional layers of complexity. Details that even Jake and Romy had not anticipated, and actions that would push the narrative into uncharted territory. What came next would not only confirm suspicions hinted at by the security logs and witness accounts, but it would also reveal behavior that was brazen, audacious, and chilling. Actions that would leave investigators, family, and the public questioning everything they thought they knew about that fateful day. Even in a house designed for precision, control, and security, there are moments that defy expectation, moments that shatter assumptions and introduce chaos where order once reigned. For investigators at the Reiner estate, one such moment occurred in a hallway that, until that point, had been considered unremarkable. It was here that a discovery was made that would shift the investigation into a new, unnerving phase, confirming suspicions and raising questions that had never been asked before. The hallway in question was centrally located, connecting multiple bedrooms, offices, and storage areas. On any ordinary day, it would have been a quiet thoroughfare, a conduit between rooms rather than a focal point of activity. But December 14th was far from ordinary. The hallway, like every other part of the estate, had been meticulously monitored. Cameras recorded movement, motion sensors tracked activity, and digital logs captured entries and exits. Yet despite this extensive surveillance, what was discovered in the hallway stunned everyone. Investigators reported finding signs that objects had been disturbed. Furniture slightly moved, small personal items shifted from their usual positions, and subtle smudges on surfaces that suggested recent handling. These were not dramatic disturbances. They were subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. But in the context of a crime scene that had been secured, even minor alterations are significant. Each displacement potentially affects the interpretation of evidence, the reconstruction of events, and the conclusions drawn by forensic analysts. The timing of the discovery added to its gravity. According to investigators, the disturbances corresponded with a period after the scene had been officially secured. This meant that someone had allegedly entered the estate while law enforcement was monitoring, potentially tampering with evidence. Security logs, motion sensors, and camera feeds all pointed toward the same window of time, creating a triangulation of suspicion that investigators could not ignore. Jake and Romy Reiner reportedly experienced a mix of shock and disbelief upon learning of the disturbances. For them, the hallway became symbolic. A tangible representation of alleged interference, a reminder that even in a highly controlled environment, actions could be taken that defied oversight. Every smudge, every shifted item, and every anomaly in the logs reinforced their concern that Tracy Reiner had acted with knowledge, intent, and audacity. Forensic teams were brought in to examine the hallway in meticulous detail. Fingerprints, DNA traces, and trace materials were collected, cataloged, and compared against the known presence of family members, staff, and investigators. The objective was to determine whether the disturbances were incidental, accidental, or deliberate. Preliminary analysis suggested that the handling was intentional. The objects were moved in a manner consistent with someone attempting to access specific areas or items while minimizing disruption to other evidence. Witnesses added another layer to the narrative. Staff members who had been in adjacent areas reported hearing faint noises, footsteps, the subtle scraping of an object, the click of a door opening and closing. Initially, these observations seemed inconsequential. But when investigators aligned the reports with digital evidence and the physical discovery in the hallway, a coherent pattern began to emerge. Someone had been deliberately navigating the estate in a calculated, purposeful way. The psychological impact on Jake and Romy was profound. The hallway, once merely a passage, had become a stage for actions that allegedly compounded the tragedy of their parents' deaths. It was no longer just a physical space. It was a manifestation of alleged betrayal, audacity, and the unsettling realization that someone within the family might act against the very foundation of trust. The discovery also challenged assumptions about the scope and sophistication of the alleged interference. To enter the hallway, move objects with precision, and avoid detection by cameras and sensors required an understanding of the estate's layout, timing, and security systems. It was not the act of a casual intruder. It was the act of someone familiar with the property, comfortable navigating it, and confident enough to take risks. Investigators now faced the complex task of reconstructing the sequence of movements. Using the digital logs, motion sensor data, and physical evidence from the hallway, they began to create a minute-by-minute timeline. Each movement, each object handled, and each anomaly was cataloged. The patterns suggested deliberate intent, reinforcing the idea that the alleged interference was not a spontaneous act, but a calculated effort to access or manipulate specific items. For the public following the case, the hallway discovery added suspense and intrigue. It introduced a tangible location where alleged interference had occurred, providing a physical reference that grounded the narrative in reality. It also amplified the stakes. If actions in this hallway could compromise evidence, what else might have been disturbed in other areas of the estate? Jake and Romy were quick to highlight the significance of the hallway in their public statements. They described it as a critical point within the estate, connecting multiple rooms that housed items of both sentimental and evidentiary importance. The disturbances were not random, they were strategic. And according to the siblings, this hallway symbolized the broader pattern of alleged interference that threatened both justice and the memory of their parents.